Well, I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited to be part of a Dying to Know Day event. And I remember when Nicole Endicott and I were in a pub, lots of things happen, often creative things happen in pubs over pizza and cider. We were hoping that Dying to Know Day would kind of take off, and it's really exciting to see what happens with Dying to Know Day every year. And I also, I guess with Dying to Know Day, want to acknowledge, I'd like to acknowledge Jane Tewson, who is the founder of Igniting Change and the person who created that amazing book, Dying to Know, which Dying to Know Day was kind of created from. So I just want to acknowledge that before I go on. It's so amazing and fantastic to see all your faces today, even though I can only see a couple of you. I also would say you're very welcome to turn your video off if you want to do that as well. I know sometimes it's really like full on staring at screens at the moment, but you're very welcome to turn the screen off. I won't feel like, offended by that. I want to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today, which is in Dubbo in New South Wales. And I'd also like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal people who may be present, but also who may be watching or listening to future versions of this online. I'd also like to acknowledge the End of Life research team. So this is the group of people who in all different ways and forms and so on have been working and chipping away at this work now for over a decade. I really am presenting a body of work that is represented by all of their kind of all of their knowledge and everything that they bring. And this combined team from Western Sydney, from John Rosenberg at the Sunshine Coast, and our La Trobe friends, Bruce and Andrea, were the team that worked on the Death Literacy Index. And of course, all led by Debbie Horsfall and Rosemary Leonard at Western Sydney University, who I've been fortunate enough to work with for many years. So the death literacy work really came from, and you can see some of our pictures there with all the kind of crazy network maps and the maps that we would do, and when we worked with people to find out a little bit about the experience of caring for people who are dying. And I'll talk a bit about that as we go today. So I just want to talk a little bit about why I do what I do. I kind of see myself as a practitioner and a researcher. So there are times where I practice community development. There are times where I practice being a clinical psychologist, but most of the time that's combined with also being a researcher. So sometimes a formal researcher, other times a researcher in the sense that I'm interested in understanding things. I'm curious about things. I'm constantly curious about things. And so I've over the past kind of 25 years, I've been working in this space, from being a clinical psych all the way through to some of the grassroots stuff that I did with the Groundswell Project. But, you know, when Peter Murray, who is a theatre maker and producer, when we developed the Groundswell Project back in 2010, we were really kind of trying to find a way to do death creatively. We were curious and wondering about what kinds of things we could do in the sector and the space. And that, of course, led to some of the recent ComCom research and my PhD, which kind of tries to understand, for people like me who kind of has a foot in both camps often, and I would imagine many of you do too, you identify with sometimes being a health professional or researcher, sometimes also straddling into community and doing community work, that we're often moving between all kinds of different settings and spaces. And I think as part of our death literacy work as a group of people, this is a really important thing to acknowledge and to kind of consider as we do this work and we move between all of those spaces. So how do we get to death literacy? So death literacy was an idea that emerged from a theme describing the transformative effect of participating in a network of friends and family, and we kept hearing stories about people saying that they learnt stuff from being part of a caring community. They learnt stuff when they supported their mate who was a carer for someone who was dying. And so we kept hearing these stories and kept wondering what it was. And I think there was something about it. So participation in end-of-life care seemed to be a catalyst for friends and families learning about the process of dying and about death care practices. So that was the other thing. Even though we were initially interested in end-of-life care and what it took to be a carer, what happened is that we heard stories that were actually beyond that. Stories about dealing with legal stuff, stories about dealing with funerals, stories about what they learned about how to care for someone after they've died in the home. All of these stories came out of this initial research that was part of end-of-life caring research initially. So when we started to think about defining death literacy, we started to think that people and communities with high levels of death literacy seem to have this kind of very specific knowledge about the death system. And I'll talk a bit about the death system in a minute. And the ability to put that knowledge into practice. So it was one thing to have the knowledge, and it was another thing to start putting that knowledge into practice in active ways. And that was something that became really significant and interesting in the research, because we were seeing not just knowledge, we were seeing knowledge and like social actions around that knowledge, that carers weren't just is the wrong word there, sorry, carers weren't passive in the experience of caring. Carers were making decisions about who they would allow into their space, what kinds of care they wanted for the person, what kind of community members they wanted in, who was allowed in and out was just one of the aspects of care that people were making decisions about. But that caring was a social action. That was one of the things that certainly for me, as one of the kind of on the ground researchers in that research, that felt like something that felt, oh yeah, I was talking in a podcast the other day, and it kind of felt like it seeped into me, that knowledge. It was really like a different way of thinking about this act of caring that certainly is not captured by just saying someone is a caregiver or someone is a carer, knowing that we know that people really struggle with identifying as that anyway. So it seemed that death literacy was also a resource that individuals and communities were using for their own benefit and strengthening their future capacity as well. Because as we went down the line with our research, we started to talk with people, not only in the inner circle of caring, but we were looking at the broader context of the care that was happening. And what we found was that even those people on the edges of caring, the ones that as health professionals, if you're a health professional, you may never ever hear about, they're the neighbours, the friends and the other people who are involved. Although I bet for a lot of you here, you know about those people, right? So those people on the edge, they're also learning. They're observing this interaction and this care that's happening. And we found evidence for they were utilizing that learning and that knowledge and taking it into future aspects of care. So that was a really important thing. We were like, okay, so we want more people, all of us want more people to be involved in caring, and we want everyone to get more capacity around caring. So how are we doing that? And I think that's where compassionate communities, many of us are thinking there's a greater role for compassionate communities in this work, because compassionate communities tends to de-center the person who is dying and their carer, and starts to look at the whole of the community surrounding that person who's dying. So We define death literacy as a knowledge about and understanding of the death system, and that these skills strengthen individual and community capacity to take action. And we positioned it in the public health palliative care framework. So we were looking at networks, connections, and people rather than individuals. So even when I talk about the Death Literacy Index in a minute, one of the things that we are interested in is looking beyond the individual and understanding how populations are doing this work, how we're doing this as groups, workplaces, schools, towns, states, nations. Sorry. It's yes, it's the individual, but actually there is this kind of broader aspect to death literacy. When we originally talked about death literacy in the 2016 paper, we talked about knowledge, skills, actions, and experiences. And as we developed the Death Literacy Index, that has adapted slightly. And we talk now about factual knowledge, practical knowledge, community knowledge, and experiential knowledge. And we'll talk a bit more about this as we go along, but you can see that the death system is about understanding components and the components and functions that we exist within that kind of mediate our experience of death, dying, loss, and grief. So when you think about the death system, what happens is you start to think beyond just what's happening in health or what's happening with volunteering or what's happening in caring, and you start to then think about all the players that are in that space. So then that opens us up to thinking about the legal system and, you know, volunteers and, you know, everyone. Kastenbaum, who's the guy who talks about, Robert Kastenbaum talks about the death system, and it comes from his work, which is really about trying to broaden the thinking about how we do death, dying, and loss and grief beyond the individual experience, and thinking about how we interact with with the networks and systems that are around us. And certainly in the research, we found evidence for that. People talking, like I was saying before, people learnt, even though they were doing end-of-life care, people learnt about funerals. People learnt about how they needed to organise that and what that meant. They also had to learn often when people were dying at home how to care for their dead, which is something they had never really thought about before necessarily. Any questions about that before I go on? Does anyone, any reflections that anyone wants to pop in the chat box so far, or anything that's kind of coming up for people? Yeah, so Helen's just said how far-reaching our circles are. That's right. So and that was certainly something that we found, that the networks, really there are lots of circles and lots of things that kind of ripple out from the person who's dying and their carer and their families. Yeah, it did really. Yeah, like this work kind of soaks into you, doesn't it, if you let it? And I think that's why it's really important that we keep self-reflecting, because it soaks into us, and we do need to be aware of that soaking and what that means and so on. Yeah, great comments. Small communities tend to take on a broader range of roles and skills. Yeah, that's really true. People, yeah. And we found evidence for that too. And I think there's a lot of evidence for taking on roles and skills and what people do. And when I think about our work as a health professional, one of the things that we're often doing is supporting families to bring to life the knowledge that is already there and the skills that are already there within their family and community, so that they can utilize those. And not everyone wants to, but for the families, when it is in front of us and it is there, then it can be such an empowering, incredible thing to watch families and communities do.
Kerrie, there's a couple of questions there.
Yep.
One is, what about death literacy, even if you're not a carer? Death literacy for individuals and coping with death in general. We avoid death until it's right in front of us. And the other one, yep, you're right.
So, yes, I mean, I think that is that's a really good point. I think I do wonder if part of the question then is it's kind of like, when is it in front of us and we're missing it, or when is it, how many opportunities are around us is one way to look at that as well. And, you know, one thing we talk about a lot with schools and kids is thinking about death literacy. There's often a push to teach death and dying in schools and to set up a curriculum. And while I don't not support that, I mean, I think that could be a really normalized kind of way to do death literacy in schools. I would also say that death and dying is on the curriculum. It is already there. It's already in Shakespeare. It's already in our theatre. It's already, there are already opportunities for teachers to explore it in biology and a whole lot of other subjects. So what I would say is, one of the things that I would encourage us to keep doing for those of us who are advocates, death literacy advocates and practitioners, then when we're going to places, we want to look at the skills that are there first. We want to look at what's already there. We want to look at building on what's existing, so that we're not reinventing and we're not actually adding additional burden into a system that might already be kind of stressed as well. All right, I'm gonna keep going, and we can even come back to some of these questions too, Lynn. If I'm missing some that seem really important, please.
Okay, well, just a very quick one before you move on so we don't miss it. Someone has asked, is this framework informing this type of work in other countries?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I've had some conversations with people in Canada and in Sweden, and currently the team at Western Sydney are actually working with other countries, Taiwan and other places, to actually look at whether or not the Death Literacy Index, for example, could be translated into other languages. And in Western Sydney, there's a project happening at the moment around developing the tool into other languages. So I think I can't answer that definitively, other than there are people starting to do it, and there are people starting to look at it. And I think we're all on a learning curve. We're all on a massive learning curve. So if you look at the amount of research and information there is about health literacy, for example, I mean, if you compare it to what we've done, what we as a collective, like across the world, done around death literacy, then it's really just, we're really only beginning. These are all very formative ideas, new ideas that I'm presenting to you today. Some of it, of course, the body of the work has been based on kind of 10 years of qualitative research. But in terms of moving forward, and I'll talk about this as we go along, we do need to, we need to be curious, and we need to know, we need to keep asking the question if we're on the right track. So I think that's part of being a researcher. You're constantly questioning what you do, how you do it, and other people will come up with new ideas and build upon any work that happens. And so I think that's an exciting part of where we're at the moment. Okay, so in terms of developing death literacy, so that's kind of the concept, like what is it? In terms of developing death literacy, what I'd like to present is some of the evidence from the research that we've done so far. And again, knowing that we're just really at the beginning of understanding where things are at. So the research that we did that is contained in the death literacy report. So I don't know if you've seen it, but the death literacy report that the death literacy index report that we recently put out, I'm using that today to show some of the data from that. But what we know is that certain experiences tend to matter, and cross-culturally, so in some of the work that we've done in both Australia, and we had at least one pilot study that was from the UK, we found that personal experience was the top thing that contributed to knowledge around death and dying. That's what people said. And we go all the way down to community activities and school, which is really interesting given that we're doing Dying to Know Day. And, you know, community activities is certainly something that has grown a lot. But I'd love to hear from you, and if you want to add stuff to the chat, but what are your personal and professional learning experiences? What has been most important and influential in your own death literacy? Family, yep. So that really comes up as a strong theme through lots of different sources of data.
Kerrie, I have a comment here. This might be a good time to bring it in. It's from Kankana, and I was shocked to find how little training care workers in aged care had in death and dying, and I had expected more help for myself in understanding what was happening to my mum from the staff. It was completely being thrown in the deep end and being on my own. I find I can only express this to friends going through the same situation.
Yeah, look, I'm so sorry to hear that, and I'm, you know, I would say, sadly, given what we're hearing from the Royal Commission, that you're not alone in that experience, and there are many of us in the community sector, as well as clinicians, who are working really hard to try and change that. And I think, so one of the things that I'm hearing from that is one of the themes that I've certainly heard over the years, which I think is really important, is that how do we share what was important with others? And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So I might be preempting, but I just do want to sit with that for a second, because we hear, you know, it is really important that there are opportunities in our communities and within our institutions to be able to share these stories. And sometimes the learning, although it's really hard learning and difficult learning, what my experience has been is people who want to kind of create a change in the system often want to find a way, or find a method to kind of share that learning with people and the sector, the community and their family. And so thank you so much for sharing that. And I would encourage you as much as you can to find your local, to find a way to kind of really, I guess, find an outlet for sharing that story. And we need more outlets. We need more ways to kind of share these stories, that's for sure. Some experiences here being shared around, okay, which one really know what happened first? Yeah, right. Thanks, Tim. That's, I mean, I think if we look at the fact that school and some of the other data that we've got around the experience of children and their first experience of death and dying, it is really important. We learn from our families about these norms and experiences. And I don't know about the idea of being made to go, but certainly in some settings, some cultures, religious or not, we certainly have an expectation that we do things together, or we do this together, that this is an important experience that we do. And some of the research from my PhD found that for death workers, any kind of death worker, whether you're a nurse or a doctor or a death doula or a midwife or a community educator, then there was usually a pivotal personal experience of some sort that really led to the work, or it led to a kind of a view of the work, the clinical work, that it was a pivotal experience that changed the track of people's professional and personal experiences. Okay, so Australians report comparatively higher levels, and I'd love to hear what you think about this in terms of your experience, personal and professional and community, that we have higher levels of learning through experience, and we have an ability to talk about issues of death and dying. They score high on the Death Literacy Index. On the other hand, people are less confident in their ability to provide hands-on care. And the weakest aspect of death literacy across the population in Australia was factual knowledge about legal and administrative processes. So people don't know what an advanced care directive is, or how to use it, or what it means, and what it means in the context of the caring that they're doing as well. So feel free to kind of add to the comments around that as well. So why is this all important? I guess the other interesting thing, and again, these are all kind of correlations, kind of associations. So we're still learning about what this all means in the context of this death literacy work more broadly. But there does seem to be a connection between death literacy and death anxiety. So our fear about the process of dying, our fears about death, our fears about dying. And we know that people who scored more highly on death literacy also reported less fear about other people's death and other people's dying. And yes, would love to hear what your thoughts are about that. But does that make intuitive sense for you? Because I guess the other part about that is that it doesn't change, having high death literacy doesn't change how you feel about your own death and your own dying. But certainly in terms of other people, I think when we think about, you know, the public health approach, and we think about public health, then imagine if people have more death literacy, then there's potentially less fear in the community. And that's I guess that's the simple way to put it, Helen. Knowledge is power. And knowledge really helps with being able to kind of make decisions about supporting and caring for someone. And interestingly, there was not a strong association with advanced care planning and death literacy, which again, for those of us working in health as well as community stuff, we often put a big emphasis on advanced care planning. And I think sometimes sometimes we do need to think about the role that advanced care planning has in the interventions that we're offering to communities. So it may be helpful to have knowledge about advanced care planning, but advanced care planning itself doesn't necessarily, unless we start to open it up, it doesn't necessarily enable us to build a community around actually making those wishes, those plans that we have, come to life. That's where we need community. We need our families, our friends and other people to support us to enact those wishes. So when we think about death literacy, we're thinking about the combination of traditional learning through books, going to volunteer programs, going to courses, doing online courses, reading, and experiential learning, getting, getting your hands, pulling your socks up, getting your hands in there, getting experienced, and getting hands-on with supporting someone. Any work being done exploring death literacy and bereavement? Oh, Joanna, that's a really good question. Not that I know of, though my understanding is, and I think this goes to say about how new this work is in the field, my understanding is that there are all kinds of literacy indexes kind of on the boil at the moment. There's certainly an aged care, end of life literacy index, and I'm sure there's a grief index, a grief literacy index, and there have been some papers written about grief literacy as well. So I would say that in terms of death literacy, again, power is knowledge. I would say that people, and the caring research that we did, people tended to have continued networks. If they worked together in the end of life period, those networks tended to stick together throughout the bereavement period and support each other. In terms of looking at what grief literacy is, then there has been some published research on that, and it would be, yeah, I would recommend that as well. That's done by Lauren Breen. So if you look up Lauren Breen and her work, you'll be able to see that as well. So when we think about developing death literacy, some of these things I've already talked about, but the personal version of this is thinking about reflecting on our own experiences and being able to provide space for ourselves, our students, our workplaces, our schools, wherever the setting we come from, providing opportunities for learning, whether it be traditional teaching or whether it be hands-on learning through volunteering. All of those things are really important. And then, like I was saying before, the being able to share your skills and experience and knowledge is also important as well. So what can we do in terms of the community version? Well, again, this is a summary of some of the stuff that we've already talked about, but capacity, having a capacity and strengths focus is incredibly important. And I think with the Death Literacy Index, what we want to do is really encourage people to use the index as a way to kind of understand the baseline for a population of people that you're working with. And that population of people, the information that you, and the Death Literacy Index provides a way of understanding where the baseline is, where people are at. So again, I'd really be interested to know about your death literacy activities. And I know it's always a bit strange doing it through chat, but like thinking outside the box, like what are the community groups, the schools, the maybe religious, non-religious, kind of other groups and activities that are happening, and this is especially timely for Dying to Know Day, but what are we already naturally doing in our communities in terms of gathering and connecting when someone is dying, needs care, or is bereaved? Would anyone like to share an experience that they've seen? And I'll just have a quick look at and Lynn and Alison, you may have some questions or thoughts that have been coming through, but let me just do a time check. Okay, we're good. A need for the awareness for the whole process, to plan your process, also including a range of counselling for yourself ahead of time once the person has passed. If there is a complex family situation, to see someone ahead of time. Yeah, absolutely. So we're starting to think beyond the individuals and thinking about how is this family doing? How's everyone doing here? If everyone's in it together, how are they supported moving forward? Great. Anyone want to share an experience? Yeah, okay, death cafes are a great example, I think, of one of the simplest things that people can do. And the thing about a death cafe is that also, I would say when I first started running them as a health professional, I kind of had like, you know, group therapy kind of in my, I don't know if this happened to you as well, Rose, and I know April runs lots of death cafes as well, but when I first started running them, I was like, but what are we going to talk about? And there's no agenda, and how is this going to go? But actually people of course, when you set the context, and this was, you know, my experience constantly over the last 10 years, you set up a context for people to come and share their stories, and people come, and they come in bucket loads, and they come and they are so open and vulnerable, and share and talk and share knowledge with each other about what's happening in their local community. And coffin clubs, that's a great example too, especially for all you Tassie peeps who get to have a coffin club. So workplace sharing, chats over tea and coffee, dropping off meals and so on. Our local school had a memorial garden. Yeah, beautiful. So events that might not seem like they're death literacy building, and are incredibly beautiful and could feel like as normal as having a cup of tea. All of these experiences add to the context of death literacy in our communities. Okay, so let's talk about the index, shall we? Has everyone has everyone like heard of the death literacy index? Oh, we've got some more comments before I move on. Also I have a death cafe, just called The Lost Art of Dying, Reviving Forgotten Wisdom. Yeah, beautiful. Time to reconnect with history. I think this is not an uncommon thing that people say, that this work, a lot of the work, or a lot of the death literacy things that we're talking about, are often a return to common sense, or a return to kind of reconnecting with one another. And I think that is, yeah, that is worth kind of reflecting on, I think. Thank you. Thank you all so much for all the comments. It's wonderful. Great. So Lynn's saying she's going to email the DLI link out to everyone who's registered. So that's fab. Thank you, Lynn. So just to summarize, so if death literacy is what we call the learning and experience for people, and compassionate communities and the work around compassionate communities is part of a movement towards thinking in terms of networks and social experiences, then what we started to wonder as researchers was, could an index, could a way of measuring, for want of a better word, help researchers and policymakers start to understand more about how death literacy develops in our populations, not individuals. So how can, and I guess the other question, or the wondering we had, was around how might an index enable community conversations in existing or indeed new compassionate community type experiences. So for everyone who's out there doing work already, the index may provide a kind of a way for you to have conversations. It could be a way for you to understand some of the changes that have happened in your community, or it could be a way for you to kind of benchmark yourself currently, where you are right now, against the Australian population. So this is the report that Lynn will send you the link for. And as I was saying before, it was a real collaboration, and the funding for went to Groundswell, to the Western Sydney University and beyond via the Wicking Trust, which was an amazing source of funding. What that funding enabled us to do as a group of people was to develop a 29-item tool. So it's not onerous, it's meant to be practical. It addresses those 4 scales that we've talked about. And in the manual, as you see it there, it's also, we also provide a whole heap of demographic and other questions that you can potentially use if you want to. So this, I'm sorry that this is maybe a bit small. Let me know. It's probably a bit small. It's not meant to be like, you know, necessarily able to see it, but it is on page 39 and 40 of the manual. So when you get the link, you can go to it and look it up. So these are the 29 items, and as you can see, it is not, it's designed to be kind of not onerous, as in there's often one question that asks you to rate how difficult or easy you would find the following, for example, in the talking support subscale here. It asks you to rate between 1 and 5 how you would score yourself on each of those 4 things. So they're the questions. So again, I'm not going to go through it all today in terms of the questions. And one of the things you can do is to reach out to me anytime. And I would hope one of my goals in the future, and the goals of the other teams who are working on this, is to be able to have more access to information around how to use the index as well. But hopefully we'll go through some of that today. I want to just give you an example of what we did. So just to give you an idea, so we in the report, there are a number of pilot organisations that use the DLI with their communities. And what I thought, it would be interesting to look at people who have not had the experience as a worker or a volunteer or training in end-of-life care. Just to show you kind of what happens, because what happens is you get a score out of 10, and that score out of 10 enables you to look at where your population, how your population compares to the national average. Does that make sense? So you provide the measure, you provide the survey, people do the survey, you add it up, you get the averages. I make it kind of sound really easy. It's kind of, there's always someone in your group who loves maths, right? Adding things up and sorting out averages. And for all the researchers who are listening, then that's easy. It's easy for you. But this gives you a sense of kind of how it looks across a set of groups. And that's for people who do not have experience as workers or volunteers or training in end of life. So what do you notice? So there's that. And then this is the group who do have experience at end of life and who have maybe done some training or been volunteers. So again, what you should notice there is that the numbers go down for everyone. People have lower death literacy when they haven't had an experience around death, dying, and bereavement. And when they do have, it increases. So that's why we talk about kind of traditional education, the value of that and how important that is, and also the experiential, that even if you're running courses in your community, even if you're providing experiences for people to be able to have discussions, read books, go to films, go to a death cafe, all of those things add to the experience of death literacy. So my question then becomes, if you're interested in using the index at all, then there are kind of 3 things to consider. If you want to use it for research, usually researchers are trying to use a tool to develop new knowledge or to test an assumption or to look at a theory in some way and test it. And most of us, however, are interested in doing evaluation. So we're doing a thing, we've got a thing that we do in our community. It might be a framework, it might be a program, it might be some education, it might be end-of-life education in nursing homes, aged care facilities, for example, like we were talking about before. We want to test whether or not this thing that we do in this place with this population or group of people, if it makes a difference, does it have merit? That's and evaluation, you can see how evaluation and research sometimes overlap, but you can do that as part of evaluation. So if you're doing evaluation, your question might be, did our program make a difference? Did death literacy change? The other way that you can use the index, and I would say that for many people, this might be the simplest and kind of the most practical way to use the tool. It really is a tool, and that is to take it into your community and start conversations with it. Use it as a way to ask questions about how we're doing around here as a community. Does that make sense, those 3 levels? Is that helpful? Because this doesn't have, the index doesn't have to be a research tool. So it can be like any other survey that we use in our communities to evaluate and to understand what's going on in our communities. So this is kind of, yep, levels are helpful, great. So this is kind of, if we're thinking about evaluation now, this is kind of how it looks. You identify, great. Identify the group you're working with, have them complete the survey, score it, and like that's a whole other lecture, you know, talk in itself, but I'm happy to talk with anyone. Just get in touch with me about scoring it and all of that. You compare it to the national, and it can be used as a conversation starter. Compare it to the national benchmarks. So going back, so you score it and then you kind of go, hey, how did we go compared to these national benchmarks? So you can see in some of these communities already that there are conversations to have. Why did we do so well on that? How come? What is it about our community that meant that we scored so highly on that or so lowly on that? What's going on around here is one way to put it. And then I would say you get those national benchmarks, and you share them with your community. So you share them, you sit down together and you talk about what it means, and it doesn't have to be complicated. What do we do? What are we doing well? Does this survey actually help us to kind of, does it challenge any of our assumptions? Like there might be an assumption that we don't talk about death around here, but actually you might find that when you ask people that they feel really comfortable doing that. How come we have these strengths and challenges? So you might come from a community that is small, that has to take care of its own constantly and is kind of used to it. So whatever the survey finds for you, that's when you come together with those community members and make a plan. So you can see how all the way through this, what I'm suggesting to you, if you're using it in a community setting, is to use it as a strengths-based approach. So to build on what we already have, to look at some of the challenges that we have. And if you're doing evaluation, then you wait a while, you know, a year, 18 months, and then you do it again and understand what is, what happened since we started having conversation groups, since we started doing that training with people, since we started blah-de-blah, what happened? Did things change? It's a question. Okay, good. Okay, so examples, so any population is a community, any group is a population, workplaces, larger populations like a town. Like if you're using compassionate cities as a framework, then you might work with your mayor, for example, or you might work with the council and say, hey, we want to understand death literacy here, and this tool will help us understand some of the aspects of death literacy. I would say, like all surveys, it has its advantages and disadvantages. Don't overthink it. So really, don't don't get caught up in feeling like you have to do research. Don't get caught up thinking that it's really complicated. You can literally put the death literacy index into a Google form and have your community do it that way. That's as simple as it could be. And you send the link via a Google form to people. Okay. So getting aware of the time. So I'm just going to summarize some of the things that we've talked about. Death literacy is our know-how around the death system, and having this know-how has found to be related to lower fear of death of others, fear of death and fear of dying of others. The death literacy index seems to be a useful way of understanding more about the death literacy of populations and understanding it, and it could be used as a way of understanding if an intervention or some kind of social intervention or a program that you are running makes a difference. And we know that developing death literacy happens via experience and kindship. I like that. I've just made up a new word. That was meant to say kinship, but I think kindship could work as well. Personal experience. So whether we're coming from a top-down perspective as a health professional or whether we're working in the grassroots with people, we can find ways to enable and support people to develop their death literacy. So for example, when I was working in palliative care, one of the questions I would often ask people was, have you done this before? What was it like? Was there anything that you learned from that experience that you're applying to this experience? You know, we can even as health professionals start kind of building this work out, and in communities we can have those same conversations. And again, I know I keep saying it, but how do we do it around here? How does it happen around here? How are we supporting each other? What are we doing to care for each other and support each other when someone is dying, when someone is grieving, and when someone is caring? And the other thing was to consider end of role planning interventions as a pathway to death literacy. So on their own, they're just one aspect. So broaden any end of life planning work that you're doing to think about whenever you're doing an advanced care plan with someone. You can always add the question, who's going to help you do this? Who's around? And that can be both the formal and the informal supports that are involved in that person's community. So I know we've done lots of conversation and discussion along the way, and in the few minutes that we have left, I'm really open to if anyone wants to stick around for a few more minutes to have a little bit of conversation. And Lynn and Alison, let me know what you think about that as well. Oh, and there's my contact details.
Yes.
One of the questions I have for all of you is, did this hit the mark in terms of your curiosity about death literacy and the death literacy index? Yes or no? Now I sound like a psychologist researcher, don't I?
Hi, Kerrie. We have a question here. Oh, where's it gone? Sasha.
Yep.
Are you worried about the overall security of death literacy and the impacts that COVID are having?
Yeah.
On grieving ritual. Sorry, I can't see it all.
Yeah, it's all right. I can see that. Thank you for pointing that out to me. You know, I think the interesting thing about COVID, though the restrictions have been, you know, so hurtful often for people and hard, and it's been so challenging, there's also been a kind of an opening up in some ways of the space. So overnight,
unknown caller.
So overnight we had to deal with a whole heap of things and do a whole heap of things that we that previously were not yet part of the space. So for example, filming, doing video conferencing with people who are dying, for example, with families. Now that if you talked about that a year ago, that would have been an incredibly challenging thing. There would have been issues about privacy and all kinds of issues. Whereas overnight we had to change that because we absolutely had to give people access to their friends and families. Conferencing, video conferencing of funerals had to change kind of overnight. People went from not having any capacity to do it to nearly every business being able to offer it. So I think that's where we start to kind of see changes in the death system. And I think the other thing that happened is people have had to, unfortunately, become aware of all of these rules and regulations. So the rules and regulations are part of, I would say, our death literacy, and we may have never have had to access those before. So yeah, I think COVID has been really challenging on lots of levels, and it has also really expanded us in other levels and changed policies overnight, which has been in some ways really phenomenal and shows you what can happen really quickly for people, like for the system as well, what can happen to the system almost immediately overnight. I just want to really thank everyone for contributing on the chat and being part of today. It's been really fantastic. So thank you so much.